Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special upload. Today is Malcolm X's birthday, and it feels really important to put together a bunch of clips that I've worked on over the last year or so, talking about Malcolm X, talking about James Baldwin, talking about the vast array of work that Malcolm X has done and his impact on a variety of levels. So this is going to be a few different compilations of exploring his significance, his sexuality, his connection to the literary figure James Baldwin. And a lot of it is also about how inspiring and powerful and militant Malcolm X is, especially as an orator. So there's going to be a bit in here where I unpack some speeches that he did with James Baldwin. And it also feels really good to come out with this video, release this episode right now, because here in Ohio, there is a horrific case that's happened May 1st here in Cincinnati. Police officers shot and killed 18-year-old Ryan Hinton. And a day later, his father, Rodney Hinton, went out and killed a police officer. And it's been all over the news. I even know this week that Rodney appeared in court and was denied bail. And all of these Cincinnati deputies showed up, lined up in the court, trying to intimidate him. There's also been some news about his family arguing with folks in the courtroom for treating them unfairly and not allowing them to see Rodney. And I just really see so much connection in this case around Black rage, what white supremacy and the pigs do to us, and how we are totally animalized in the media when we do anything to defend ourselves. And so it just feels really necessary to honor our past in this moment, look clearly at our present, and understand that self-defense is, to the state, it's literally seems insane. It seems insane that we want to defend ourselves or to defend the people that we love for the trespasses that have been done against them. And it's just, I don't know, it's very jarring to look back at history, to hear these messages, and then to see these messages and radical actions refracted today. So read some Malcolm X, pay attention to what's happening in your communities, and stay tuned for the rest of this episode. And if you haven't looked into the Ryan Hinton and Ronald Hinton case, or Rodney Hinton case, look into it, talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your community, and be prepared to defend yourselves and other people, because that's the world we live in. On to the episode.
Philosophy or a gospel, I don't care whether it's a religious gospel, a political gospel, an economic gospel, or a social gospel. If it's not going to do something for you and me right here, right now, to hell with that gospel. So we have to have a new approach, a new appraisal. And this new appraisal and new approach has to be in tune with the reality of the conditions that we are in after having been thoroughly brainwashed by this blue-eyed white man.
So first, we should probably talk about who Malcolm X was. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, was a prominent African-American civil rights leader and advocate for Black empowerment. His journey towards activism began in prison, where he educated himself extensively, particularly through the teachings of Nation of Islam. After his release in 1952, he became a minister and prominent spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. But however, in 1964, he broke ties with NOI due to ideological differences and allegations made against Elijah Muhammad for his extramarital sexual affairs and his affairs with young women. Malcolm X continued his activism to be the founder of the Organization of Afro-American Unity and traveling extensively to spread his message of Black pride, self-determination, and unity. And eventually, Malcolm X was tragically assassinated on February 21st of 1965 in New York City.
Being born here in America doesn't make you an American. Why, if birth made you American, you wouldn't need any legislation. You wouldn't need any amendments to the Constitution. No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism. One of the 22 million black people who are the victims of democracy. nothing but disguised hypocrisy. And I see America through the eyes of a victim. I don't see any American dream, I see an American nightmare.
We're supposed to be off the streets by 10 o'clock.
If we shoot, we're going to shoot to kill.
Baldwin still participated in certain heteronormative politics. Malcolm X said to James Baldwin, "I'm a warrior of the revolution and you're the poet." The thing that people are kind of spicy and curious about, since James Baldwin did say that Malcolm X might have been his soulmate, is, were they gay lovers? Were they gay for each other? All of my social media accounts, when I've been posting about James Baldwin, posting about Malcolm X, the thing that people are kind of spicy and curious about, since James Baldwin did say that Malcolm X might have been his soulmate, is, were they gay lovers? Were they gay for each other? We're not going to pontificate about that in this video, but I want to take us back in time once again. The year is 1961, and James Baldwin has agreed to do a debate with Malcolm X. This is during a period of time where the civil rights movement is in full swing. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King are very much at the height of their fame. Their political discourse and debate is very much in the public. James Baldwin wants to throw in on what is happening. I think this context is really interesting because James Baldwin and Malcolm X met each other for the first time on the public stage, debating national politics, using their logic, using their debate skills, using their ability to look at history and translating it in ways that are interesting to people. It says a lot about them as figures, and it is so cool that they met this way. At one point in their friendship, in their dynamic, that Malcolm X said to James Baldwin, "I'm a warrior of the revolution and you're the poet." And this stuck with Baldwin. I think through reading so much of Baldwin, you can see that he hungered to be a part of the civil rights movement, that he hungered to be accepted and understood by the larger Black community. So to have someone like Malcolm X support him probably meant a lot. But before we dig into their specific relationship, I want to break down some of the basics about both of these figures. Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little on May 19th, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, was a prominent African-American civil rights leader, activist, Nation of Islam advocate, and revolutionary. His early life was marked by tragedy, with his father's death at the hands of white supremacists and his mother's subsequent mental breakdown, leading to his placement in foster care and eventual involvement in criminal activity. While serving a prison sentence, Malcolm converted to the Nation of Islam, a Black nationalist religious movement. The Nation of Islam organized greatly throughout all of the prisons throughout the 60s and 70s. They were a big proponent of why there was such a big Black power or prisoners' rights movements, especially in the 60s, because they organized so effectively. They were able to funnel people that went into jail through drugs and other illicit activities into these more structured lives that kind of mimicked some of the hyper-militancy of the Black Panther Party, which I think is interesting. While serving a prison sentence, Malcolm X converted to the Nation of Islam, a Black nationalist religious movement. Upon his release in 1952, he became a minister and spokesperson for the NOI, advocating for Black separatism and self-defense in the face of racial oppression. And what I think is interesting about this debate is that you can see kind of the wheels turning in both Baldwin and Malcolm X's head. They are both very good at referencing history, referencing different forms of literature. They're both good at bringing in material examples of racialized oppression alongside material examples of white supremacy. They both have a sense of humor. I think that is also something that really comes through. And some points that I want to mention is around 235. At one point in the debate, Malcolm X says, "I think that this, in my opinion, was why we disagree with the sit-in movement. If we're willing to wait for another 100 years for the white man to change his mind, to accept them as human beings, then they're wrong. But if they're willing to lay down their life tonight or in the morning in order that we can have what is ours right tonight or in the morning, then it is a good move. But as long as they're willing to wait for the white man to make up his mind and they're qualified to be respected as human beings, then I'm afraid that all of their waiting and their planning is for naught." One interesting distinction in how James Baldwin and Malcolm X both dive into racialization is that James Baldwin they agree on a certain level. Baldwin is very much a supporter of the fact that racialization altogether can be a destructive force, that the notion of racial hierarchy is a destructive force. And you can see that Baldwin returns to this a lot and a lot again in this work. He says in this discussion with Malcolm X,
"There is nobody in the world, I think, sadder than a white man in the deep South who only has his skin and his blue eyes and his yellow hair."
how
how bigotry erases our humanity. And this can be bigotry towards oneself, bigotry towards others, the erasure of other people's history. So Baldwin is very clear on this, but I think on some level, Baldwin at this point is still able to articulate some of the hope that blacks and whites or whatnot may come together. But Baldwin still definitely does have very succinct criticisms of the white elite and moderate. Malcolm X, he also is against kind of these forms of racialization, but I think he's more against it in terms of how racialization has been articulated in the processes of colonization. Both James Baldwin and Malcolm X are very ardently against colonization, but I think they're both very aware of the negative effects of colonization and how it relates to the black body and how the black body exists and operates within the context of the United States of America. I think is very useful, very interesting. It's why I think Baldwin, on some level, aligns with Malcolm X a little bit more because of the realness, because of the anger of what he's presenting. But you can also see at various points throughout James Baldwin's career that he's also against militancy to some degree. But of course, in the coming years, with the oncoming assassinations, a lot of that in James Baldwin's personality and political outlook would change. He would turn more towards supporting youth movements and militancy. I love being able to look back at history and understand the nuances of how people related to movements. I think just like today, how I, as an organizer, as a black anarchist, am against certain inherent demands for nonviolence and peaceful protesting that I think certain parts of the black political movement will advocate for. I'm not against that shit. And so it's cool for me as a modern day revolutionary and radical to look at the past and be able to analyze very clearly, here are the ways that James Baldwin and Malcolm X found common ground. Here are the ways that they understood and cared about each other. Here are the ways that they were able to articulate this on the public stage. Going beyond 1961, James Baldwin and Malcolm X are aligning very much in terms of wanting more for their people and being frustrated with the natural state of the mass black political movement and leaning more towards a deeper black militancy that would be represented by the Black Panther Party, by the Black Power movement, by the Black Liberation Army. And this is also shown in Baldwin's work during this same year, 1961. In 1961, James Baldwin wrote a piece for Harper's Magazine titled "The Dangerous Road Before Martin Luther King." I mean, he pushed for the March on Washington, he pushed for voting rights, and especially with the Vietnam War on the horizon and ravaging so much of our national politics and black people being drafted abroad, you can see turning more towards a politics that wanted to center, especially near the late 1960s, on economics, on labor rights, on basically attacking poverty in a way that would kind of bridge the gap between racial justice and economic justice. And in a lot of ways, this is what scared the establishment in terms of in the end of Martin Luther King's life. And it's why a lot of people say that he was targeted, especially near the end, why he was eventually assassinated. Similar things can be said for Malcolm X. Near the end of his life, between 1961 and 1965, when he was killed, Malcolm X fell out with the Nation of Islam. He had a lot of very valid critiques about Elijah Muhammad and the double standards that Elijah Muhammad held himself to versus members of the Nation of Islam.
There has been much written and said about your departure from the Black Muslim organization. Could you tell us exactly why you did leave the organization?
Well, I didn't leave, number one. I was put out, no matter. And since there was no justification for them putting me out, they had to make it appear to the public that I left of my own volition. But it was in February of 1963 that Wallace Muhammad, one of the sons of Elijah Muhammad, pointed out to me that his father had a very serious moral problem, which he had kept a careful secret up to that point. But that when I heard about it, I went directly to Elijah Muhammad. We discussed it. He explained it. He even admitted it to me, as well as to his some of his other children. He discussed it with his other children. But when he gave me his religious interpretation or explanation of it, I accepted it. But about 5 months went by, and Wallace pulled me aside again and told me that his father hadn't changed. He was still involved in the same thing.
This led to increased surveillance. Malcolm X's star kind of climbs. He is both being targeted and surveyed by the state and being targeted and surveyed by the Nation of Islam. And throughout the rest of their years, James Baldwin and Malcolm X would see each other in passing. Despite the fact that James Baldwin did call Malcolm X his soulmate, I kind of see throughout their works that they were very much in passing with each other. I assume they saw each other at events. They probably had some private conversations, but I don't know how much in deep coalition they were. And that's something that I kind of want to dig into later on in relation to the 60s and how Baldwin portrays his relation to these movements and these men that have been slain. Were James Baldwin and Malcolm X friends? How close were they? There's also this other kind of lore out there about Malcolm X potentially being queer, bisexual, not straight. And I'm going to put some references on the screen, but there has basically been lore out there for a period of time that in his days of like drug dealing and being on the streets, which eventually led him to go to jail and to be radicalized in jail, that for a period of time, Malcolm X might have been a sex worker and that he might have been a sex worker that engaged with men and women. And I think in terms of like our historical imagery and mindset, it is important not to assert what someone in the past, what their sexuality was, unless it was written about or they expressed it themselves. But I do think it is important to not shut off history from certain possibilities that people are aware of in different capacities. And I think on one level, it is interesting looking at Malcolm X in relation to other Black men of the movement of his time, because you can see MLK was a little iffy about James Baldwin's queerness. Eldridge Cleaver was definitely antagonistic. There were also white people that shitted on James Baldwin for his queerness and his perspective. Malcolm X, I think, from the very start, respected James Baldwin very much. It is also known through James Baldwin's writings that him and Malcolm X did meet before 1961. And I want to read in No Name in the Street, James Baldwin writes, "I had heard a great deal about Malcolm, as had everyone else, and I was a little afraid of him, as was everyone else. And I was further handicapped by having been out of the country for so long. When I returned to America, I again went to the South and thus imperceptibly found myself mainly on the road. I saw Malcolm before I met him. I had just returned from some place like Savannah. I was giving a lecture in New York, and Malcolm was sitting in the first or second row of the hall, bending forward at such an angle that his long arms nearly caressed the ankles of his long legs, staring up at me. I was very nearly panicked. I knew Malcolm only by legend, and this legend, since I was a Harlem street boy, I was sufficiently astute to distrust. I distrusted the legend because we in Harlem been betrayed so often. Malcolm might be the torch the white people claimed he was, though in general, white America's evaluations of these matters would be laughable and even pathetic, did not have these evaluations have such wicked result. Or he might be the hustler I remembered from my pavements. On the other hand, Malcolm had no reason to trust me either, and so I stumbled through my lecture with Malcolm never taking his eyes from my face. It must be remembered that in those great days, I was considered to be an integrationalist. This was never quite my own idea of myself, and Malcolm was considered to be a racist in reverse. This formulation in terms of power, and power is the arena in which racism is acted out, means absolutely nothing. It may even be described as a cowardly formulation. Powerless, by definition, can never be racist, for they can never make the world pay for what they feel or fear except by the suicidal endeavor which makes them fanatics or revolutionaries or both. Whereas those in power can be urbane and charming and invite you to those which they know they will never own. The powerless must do their own dirty work. The powerful have it done for them. This context is very interesting, especially Baldwin noting his understanding of how the public perceived him to be an integrationalist and how the public perceived Malcolm to be a racist in reverse. And I love that Baldwin makes the clarification that people that are subjugated can't hold power against those that subjugate them, and how this lobbing of criticism of Malcolm X being racist isn't actually true in terms of how we see power dynamics play out. I love this interaction because you see that James Baldwin has somewhat of a distrust for another figure in the movement. You see that James Baldwin respects Malcolm X, that he finds him beautiful, captivating, interesting. And I'm really interested in how their intimate interactions were. I could imagine Malcolm X being a great supporter of James Baldwin and vice versa. I can imagine how devastating it probably was when James Baldwin learned that Malcolm X had been assassinated in 1965, only a few years after they had initially met. I think if you watch the documentary Meeting the Man, which I featured in my last Baldwin video, you can see that These killings, these murders, deeply affected James Baldwin. And it shows up in a lot of his language. He says, they were killing my friends, these are my people, it really hurt. My last consideration for this video is the question of how close was James Baldwin actually to these people in the movement, like Medgar Evers, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, which he so ardently wanted to write about. And there is some perspective out there on whether or not James Baldwin was actually close to these people. And it's in this book that I have right here. I actually read this book maybe like 2 years ago, and it's called Talking at the Gates, A Life of James Baldwin by James Campbell. I would say in terms of my own ranking of James Baldwin biographies, this is definitely like number 2 under David Lemming's biography on James Baldwin. I would say read that one and then read this one. But the reason I love this one is because, especially near the latter end, it delves into some really, I think, interesting and valid critiques and perspectives on Baldwin, which aren't so glossy and fun and cool and interesting. Like, he really kind of reads Baldwin for filth in certain ways. And I want to dig into a section of this that kind of explores whether or not Baldwin was actually close with these people. Baldwin began to fear, and who could say that this was not within his rights, that he would be next. Someone might have easily considered it a useful strike against Black power or just against Blacks, to take a shot at the highly visible, outspoken writer. Yet, his trepidation, while justified, was also disproportionate. Baldwin's importance to the movement was considerable, but not as great as he seems at times to have believed it was. What did he mean, for example, by telling Injun Césaire just a week after King's death that he was now the Black elder statesman, and that he was the only mobile Black American left? And although the FBI was certainly keeping a close eye on his movements, it was overstating the case to assume, as he did, that they had his every change of direction covered and his conversations taped. Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin, he frequently repeated the tragic refrain, which were, each in his own way, in a different category of civil rights leadership from Baldwin, as was their contemporary avatar, Stokely Carmichael, to whom Baldwin considered himself the older brother. He seriously believed that he was in as much danger physically as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, says Kenton Keith, a friend from the Istanbul days and cultural attaché to the U.S. Embassy there. He wasn't. Yet Baldwin persisted in his disbelief, once more involuntarily compressing the matter of his daily life into legend as the details of actual experience began to fade. During the 11 years of their acquaintance, he had met King at irregular intervals, had been ever ready to speak at marches, and had exchanged sporadic correspondence with him. Yet, in a life profile of 1971, he is found casting the relationship in terms of public and private equals, referring first to Medgar, Malcolm, and Martin and me, he continued. We, Baldwin and King, had been young together. We trampled over the South together. We had even dared to hope together. In an interview the year before, he pointed to the catalog of assassinations. I loved Medgar. I loved Martin and Malcolm, and continued, we all worked together and kept the faith together. This distinction about Baldwin, I think, is fascinating and interesting and necessary to look at. I have been an organizer since 2014. I've been writing since 2008. In a lot of ways, my organizing life has existed alongside my writing life, but my organizing life has transformed the way that I write, the way that I talk about political issues, the way that I write about political movements, the way that I engage in political spaces. I think he is more of an advocate for the causes that he was organizing around and less of an organizer. Labels and distinctions in terms of history matter, because if Baldwin viewed himself as a fellow peer alongside Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, in what ways did he view himself as a peer? Being Black men in the struggle to bring consciousness and truth to the masses. But in terms of what that truth represented and how that truth challenged people and what that meant on an actionable level, Baldwin produced art and debated about it and engaged with people in very real and material ways. But being an organizer and bringing people together and raising funds and directing campaigns and hosting trainings and all of those other things is a very distinctively different skill set, although it is related to the process of being an artist. There is this sadness that I read in these later kind of critiques or considerations of Baldwin maybe not being as close to these figures as he said that he was. But I think this is also a symptom of him being Black and queer and radical, and how those experiences can otherize you from a movement, while also Baldwin is someone that feels a great sense of love and nostalgia and almost like permission for the men around him, which is why I think a lot of people criticize Baldwin on certain levels for not going as hard as he could about misogyny and misogynoir. And I think some of that is a symptom of the fact that Baldwin was queer and not totally like... Baldwin still participated in certain heteronormative politics, although he turned against others. Were Baldwin and Malcolm X friends? How close was Baldwin in general to other people in the movement? Did he hyperbolize these things? A lot can be left up to consideration, although there is some evidence in the past. What do you think? Do you think Baldwin and Malcolm X were close? Did they have a kinship that was maybe stronger than Baldwin and some of the other men in the movement? Why? Could Malcolm X maybe have been queer, and did Baldwin hyperbolize his connection to these people in order to feel closer to the Black community, especially as someone who was always on the go and always on the move? Tell me what you think and comment with what other things you might want to learn about James Baldwin.
Ever since I filmed my last video and I learned once again that Malcolm X was 6'4".
B-I to the S-E-X-U-A. It's a L if you hating on me, bitch, I slay. No, I am.
It raised a lot of questions, like, how tall was he? Was he bi? Oh my God, you're lying on a Muslim man, or he would have never done that, or that's not him, like you can't lie on the past, or he was a man, and blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I'm here to give you research. You draw your own conclusions.
And y'all like to say we selfish, and y'all say we like to cheat, but I don't, they both at the same time. Haters have a seat. I like girls, oh my gosh, big booty, big tits. I like guys too, though, super sexy, big dick, and if you hating on me, ho.
Was Malcolm X bisexual? And why or why not doesn't matter. When we think about this, we can think about gay panic. We can think about whether or not exploring this is discrediting his legacy. We can think about whether or not these allegations are true. The paper trail behind if Malcolm X was bi is very interesting to me. This video is going to break down my research process, explore some of the different research considerations that I learned while digging into this. And then at the end, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why or why it doesn't matter whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual, whether it be gay panic, or whether it be the fact that this is just like a salacious rumor that makes people think about. He, near the end of his life, worked with the writer Alex Haley to make an amazing autobiography about his experiences, his life, his activism, what radicalized him. Malcolm X is known for being a charismatic and angry and fiery orator. He is such a smart man. And he's also known for being a very big critique of Martin Luther King Jr. up until the last year or two of Malcolm X's life, because Malcolm X was very much against the nonviolent direct action strategy because he believed that it compelled Black people to believe in the intrinsic kind of morality of whiteness and white people, when, as far as his racial and religious perspective, a lot of white people are the devil. I think he's funny. I think he's charismatic. I think he knows how to work a crowd. When I think about this bisexuality or sexuality question, maybe his ability to work a crowd where I'm like, this is a little bit of queer culture. I don't want to assume anyone's sexuality, but I also know that Black history is filled with queer and historical erasure, especially of LGBTQIA people. And I will also say, I do think there is this interesting kind of gray area in how we name and understand sexuality as it changes through time, because what people might have called gay or bisexual or queer in the past is different than our associations and relations to it today. Immediately when I started researching this, one of the first things that comes up online are a few different Reddit threads that explore this question 3 years ago in the Black LGBTQ Reddit. So I read a few articles saying Malcolm X was bi. I've read the autobiography of Malcolm X by Alex Haley. Alex Haley was good friends with Malcolm and basically just told Alex Haley what to put in the book. And this goes on to question the same-sex experiences, whether or not this is true, from 3 years ago. And there's a bunch of different responses. People saying, I've seen Malcolm X several times and I've never seen or heard of him having sexual relations with men. These Reddit threads are interesting because you can really see people going to town. There's another one from 9 years ago that is from a Guardian piece called Malcolm X was bisexual. And these Reddit threads, I think, are evidence of the fact that people are curious. As far back as 10 years ago, people were wondering, was Malcolm X bisexual? This Bruce Perry book, which I'm going to talk about a lot later, was published, I believe, in 1991. And it even says on it that it was the first complete biography of Malcolm X. But essentially throughout this book, there are various references to Malcolm X potentially being bisexual. So in his younger years, hanging hanging out in Harlem and other places in New York, this book talks about the kind of places that he frequented and the people that he would meet. And some of these would be bars, speakeasies, where there would be sex workers there. And this section of the book reads, Small's Paradise was not Malcolm X's only schoolroom. He spent considerable time in an after-hours speakeasy named Creole Pete's, which opened for business at 3 a.m, just before the last of Harlem's legitimate bars had to close. Pete Robinson, the owner, had a big gap between his upper front teeth, just as Malcolm did, but what made him notice Malcolm was that he didn't buy any drinks. Nor did he try to pick up women. He just stood around the small, cramped makeshift nightclub, studying those who did. Pete, who was not operating a charity, finally cornered him and said, "This is a drinking establishment, young man." "Yes, sir, Mr. Robinson," Malcolm replied. "May I carry those dishes for you? Allow me to hold that tray." Each time Creole Pete made up his mind to put him out, Malcolm ingratiated himself in some other way. Malcolm also learned a lot at the Harlem rooming house where he slept. Several of the tenants were prostitutes, some of whom Malcolm befriended. He said he trusted them more than he trusted women who weren't prostitutes. After all, a streetwalker couldn't really disappoint you. Surprisingly, Malcolm X's sex education came primarily from the prostitutes, not from Bia, whom he still saw, but was apparently more a showpiece than anything. The instruction, Malcolm said, was entirely verbal. A bout he had with the clap may have had something to do with it. But though Malcolm said he preferred to sleep with women who cared for him, the sexual partners he picked. And there are various parts of the book where the author, Bruce Perry, talks about how he did not intend to write a biography about Malcolm X. And then in 1971, with the help of John Fitzpatrick, the Massachusetts Commissioner of Correction, the author obtained access to Malcolm X's voluminous prison record, which led him to Malcolm Jarvis, one of the 2 or 3 men Malcolm's autobiography transformed into the fictional character Shorty. Jarvis, in turn, led Bruce Perry to dozens of people who had known Malcolm when he was a teen hustler. One of them was Gloria Strother, whom he wanted to marry. Aided by court records, Bruce Perry located the young sister of the white woman who had been Malcolm X's girlfriend during the 60s. When I telephoned and requested an interview, she was receptive. Another section of the book, in a chapter titled Part-Time Hustler, it reads, this is a section of the book where Malcolm is really in need for money before he goes to prison, and it reads, Malcolm also worked ostensibly as a butler for a wealthy Boston Braham whose living quarters overlooked the Boston Common. His bachelor employer, William Paul Lennon, was hazy about the exact nature of Malcolm's duties when he was questioned about them, nor did he say why he hired a male to do what he characterized as general housework. There was good reason for Mr. Lennon's lack of clarity. According to Jarvis, Lennon paid Malcolm to disrobe him, place him on his bed, sprinkle him with talcum powder, and massage him until he reached climax. Lennon, who was virtually the same age Earl Little would have been if he had lived, was old enough to be the gentle, loving father Malcolm had never wanted. Malcolm would later assert that someone else, not he, was giving Lennon his satisfaction, though another man did take part in some of the rubdowns, Malcolm himself actively participated. He later described the proceedings to Jarvis. Like a prostitute, he sold himself as if the best he had to offer was his body. Malcolm X's income-producing homosexual activity was sporadic. Nevertheless, it may have been an impediment in his quest for a satisfying masculine self-image. It constituted a key link in a chain of events that included the absence of appropriate male role models, tyrannical females at home and school, the excessive demands that had been made on him, the fact that there was no one to teach him how to meet those demands, his fear of combat, his unavenged trouncings at the hands of Bill Peterson, Hank Ross, and others, the shock he apparently felt when he discovered a milky substance seeping from his breast, his unsatisfying sexual experiences, and his inability to support himself or make his way in a competitive, bigoted world. Perhaps that is why he asserted years later that a man's greatest urge is the need to feel masculine. And I think this section is interesting because there are certain assumptions about Malcolm X's psyche that I think this author is making that some of the later critiques that I'm going to bring up will address. So in some of the reading, I'm kind of like, is this a white man writing about Malcolm X? And let's look up a picture of Bruce Perry. Yeah, it's a white man. What I think is essentially interesting there is that it's breaking down how the world emasculates Black men and what that in turn leads Black men to do. And there is a lot of interesting kind of analysis and considerations in this politics. There's the fact that Malcolm X was on the streets. There's the fact that he was a part of like Black culture. There's the fact that he was like in street culture, like selling drugs, helping pimp people out. And so there is a very clear vision of masculinity that I think these spaces demand of people. You have to be machismo, you have to be tough, you have to be strong. But similar to how I kind of analyzed how James Baldwin speaks with Nikki Giovanni in his conversation with Nikki Giovanni in my other video essay, if you haven't checked that out, you should. There is this sort of sociopolitical need for people analyzing these Black male figures to skirt over the fact that this need to feel masculine. I think a lot of these academics are rationalizing it in a way that I think there is more room for criticality. And this isn't to say that I believe that everything that Perry is saying, but it is to say that I don't think it is a logical kind of jump to say, oh, he didn't have any like clear male role models and he was in the streets, so it made him want to be masculine, which made him want to be with men. I think there is a bit of like a dissonance in this logic that I don't think is really respecting the complexity of what a queer experience could be if Malcolm X was queer or LGBTQIA. But I do like that this is exploring some of the places that Malcolm X frequented, the kinds of people that he met, how he might have thought about sex work or prostitutes, and how when you're in spaces with people and you need cash and you need money, sex work is a way that a lot of people find money. There are a lot of resources and writers and sex positive and sex work positive anarchists and far leftists out there that write and talk about sex work much greater than I could. So I will put some of those up on screen. There is something to be said about the fact that I think we have to consider the complexity of what Malcolm X's street lifestyle might have been like and the kind of things that he might have resorted to make money. And gay for pay sex work wouldn't be the most surprising thing to me. You know what I mean? And then there is another section in this text. It's earlier on. It's in a chapter called The Long Hard Road. And this basically talks about some experiences that Bruce Perry claims through interviews that Malcolm X had that when he was younger, that he might have sexually experimented with other boys his age. There is more references to this in Bruce Perry's book. So if we go from Bruce Perry's book to reading what Malcolm X writes about his own life and sexuality and political expressions in his famed autobiography, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, there is one section that kind of speaks to the combination of characters that Bruce Perry asserts were kind of funneled into this character of Shorty. And I want to read this in Malcolm X's own words. In a section of the book, Malcolm X is essentially talking about some of the people he met from the streets and how some of these people eventually led to him engaging in a robbery, which eventually led to him being incarcerated. He writes, Rudy's mother was Italian. His father was a Negro. He's born right there in Boston, a short, light-skinned fellow, a pretty boy type. Rudy worked regularly for an employment agency that sent him to wait on tables at exclusive parties. He had a side good going, a hustle that took me right back to the old steering days in Harlem. Once a week, Rudy went to the home of this rich, old rich Boston bluebud, pillar of the society aristocrat. He paid Rudy to undress them both, then pick up the old man like a baby, lay him on his bed, then stand over him and sprinkle him all over with talcum powder. Rudy said the old man would actually reach his climax from that. I told him and Shorty about some of the things I'd seen. Rudy said, as far as he knew, Boston had no organized specialty sex houses, just individual rich whites who had their private specialty desires catered to by Negroes who came to their houses camouflaged as chauffeurs, maids, waiters, or some other accepted image. Just as in New York, these were the rich, the highest society, the predominantly old men, past the age of ability to conduct any kind of ordinary sex, always hunting for new ways to be sensitive. Rudy, I remember, spoke of one of the old white men who paid a black couple to let him watch them having intercourse on his bed. Another couple was so sensitive that he paid him to sit on a chair outside a room where a couple was. He got a satisfaction just from imagining what was going on inside. And what I think is interesting here is that if you look at Perry's text and you look at Malcolm X's text, the description of the sex work involved is the same. And I will say this as a memoirist, as a writer myself, I published my first book 2 years ago. It's titled When They Tell You to Be Good. When you are writing your own memoir, and granted, Malcolm X was working with Alex Haley. Malcolm X passed away partway through the writing of this. From the studies that I've done, Alex Haley took some license to kind of craft the story after Malcolm X passed away. But when you're writing memoir, you take considerations on what to include. It's a very common thing that if you don't want to tie everything to like the actual factual event, but you want to express what happened, people recommend changing 3 details about a person or combining characters or combining stories or where things are referenced. And I'm not going to speculate that Malcolm X necessarily did this. For writers, this is a very real literary tool that writers use to not necessarily lie about the past, but to restructure it in a way that makes the author comfortable with what they're exploring or writing about. And so from that perspective, I think these similarities can kind of maybe signal to the fact that this maybe was a part of Malcolm X's writing process, rearranging things, making sure that things were expressed in a way that was comfortable to him, and that could also speak to a kind of deeper or more essential truth. There is a critical perspective on these different allegations about Malcolm X being bisexual, and I want to bring this in because it's not only important to kind of talk about, was he bi? What kind of gay was he? Blah, blah, blah. I don't know. So there are critiques of some of these allegations of Malcolm X being bisexual. And I'm going to read a particular piece from Malcolm X's daughter where she responds to some of these. Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention by Manning Marable. There is a response piece where basically Malcolm X's daughter was interviewed about her perspectives on this book. And I haven't read this book yet. Let me know if you want me to do another video where I explore some of the allegations or the things mentioned in Manning Marable's book. But in this particular article, the interviewer asks Miss Shabazz if she's read Manning Marable's book, and she responds, I actually skimmed through it. I was really surprised that his research would be so limited, and some of the accusations, actually, I guess I could call them speculations, that he didn't really have much evidence. And if I think to put some of the things he put in that book without having some real accurate evidence, it was surprising to me. The interviewer goes on to ask, did this author interview you? And she basically says, I had 6 sisters, and in the 20 years it took this author to do this book, a lot of them died. And then she even says, I had many discussions with the author, but he never explicitly said, interview you for this book. The interviewer asks, but he never discussed your parents' interpersonal relationships. Is that the part that most concerns you about what you've heard so far? You say you haven't read the book in its entirety, but is that the part you take issue with the most? And then Malcolm X's daughter responds, right. I think the things that I take issue with are the fact that he said my father engaged in a bisexual relationship, a homo. You know, he had a gay lover who was an elder white businessman, I think in his late 50s when my father was in his teens. And you know, my father was an open book, and we actually have 4 of the missing chapters from the autobiography. And you know, he is very clear in his activities, which nothing included being gay. And certainly he did not have anything against gay. He was for human rights, human justice, you know. If he had a gay encounter, he likely would have talked about it. And what he did talk about was someone else's encounter. Oh, and the interviewer then goes on to ask, is it possible that this author had access to information you did not? And then Malcolm X's daughter says, not at all. I mean, listen, I have a lot of friends who are gay. I have, you know, I hate to say, but some of my best friends are gay, okay? So if my father experienced persons of the same sex before he became the icon Malcolm X, you know, then that would be his experience, but he would have spoken about it. And I think because there are so many other allegations, especially that my mother cheated on him with his best friend when he was in Africa, if we even consider that the FBI looked for a very long time for something to get on my father, something to discredit or tarnish his image, then certainly they would have found the information. And even Dr. Marable puts in his book that the FBI files indicated that Malcolm X was a saint. And then it goes on to say, so, you know, if my father had these, you know, relationship with a man, if my mother had extramarital affairs, you know, I don't have a problem with accepting that my parents aren't perfect. They are human beings, but that is not the case. And I think it's unfortunate that you would have scholarly men put this kind of stuff in a book for sensationalism. Reading this, it does give me a lot of pause and consideration. Malcolm X's daughter is coming at this in a very respectful way. She's being very direct. I mean, some of the ways she talks about, like, I have gay friends. It's like we all can kind of be like, But I think she's being very clear. My father didn't have anything with gay people. He didn't have any problem with human rights. She also talks about all these other allegations that are against her family, that to some degree these allegations could have been spread by the FBI in their pursuits of the COINTELPRO program.
Fred Hampton seemed to know that he was being threatened by something in the shadows.
COINTELPRO was a clandestine program that J. Edgar Hoover had started, and it targeted all the movements, but in particular the black movement. But Hoover had a particular thing for the Panthers, who he said were the greatest threat to the security of the U.S.
COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. It was launched by the FBI in 1956. But as the revolutionary atmosphere of the US came to a simmer in the 1960s, so too did the FBI's covert surveillance of activist groups.
It was not public, but in all cities that had Panther offices, all the heads of the offices were directed to come up with hard-hitting programs attacking the Panthers. And their motive was to disrupt, destroy, and neutralize the Panthers by any means necessary, prevent the unity of black nationalist groups. And there was one other COINTELPRO objective that was specifically an order from Hoover to the FBI offices: prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the black masses.
And so it is interesting that Mrs. Shabazz is bringing in the fact that if the FBI was really surveying Malcolm X, would it not make sense that they would eventually find this kind of information? If we're thinking about Bruce Perry's kind of timeline of when Malcolm X might have allegedly engaged in more queer LGBTQ relationships, it would have been in his teenage years. It would have been in his 20s, which probably would have been the time before he was even on the FBI's radar, because he wasn't even really a part of the Nation of Islam. I understand and I get everything that Malcolm X's daughter is saying, and I think she brings in a lot of great points about why I kind of make so much content about James Baldwin and why I'm excited to dive more into these discussions about these different aspects of history, is because I think romanticism of these political figures can also make it so easy to sensationalize certain aspects of them or attach to a certain aspect to suit our own needs. And I can say this kind of like exploration of whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual or was he queer does kind of feel like it falls into that category of contemporary audiences wanting to latch onto something else to have a different level of relatability to this person. This is kind of besides my later considerations that I want to dig into about why it might matter whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual, but in terms of nostalgia and romanticism, it might be important for us to be critical of especially white people when they're writing about these figures, these movements, these histories, because really, how credible is Bruce Perry and Manning Marble in the writings that they did, especially if Malcolm X's daughter talked to Manning Marble over numerous years and is like, yeah, he never actually asked if he could interview me. And then there is another Guardian piece that came out in 2005 titled Malcolm X Gay Black Hero. And in this piece, it reads, in New York, two of Malcolm X's friends from Michigan remember bumping into him at the YMCA, where Malcolm X bragged he earned money servicing queers. Later, Malcolm worked as a butler to the wealthy Boston bachelor William Paul Lennon. So in ending off this video, I really want to take seriously the question of, was Malcolm X bisexual? Was he LGBTQIA? And why doesn't it matter? And the first kind of consideration when I think about exploring this question, especially as a queer person myself, is the whole gay panic defense. Malcolm X came up in very machismo political cultures and spaces, being in the streets, being in prison, being in Nation of Islam. If you read his book, it literally says like, Nation of Islam says that a man should marry a woman half his age plus 5. When we're looking at how compulsive heteronormativity encourages straight people or straight passing people to rely on gay panic or gay panic responses, to turn away from sexuality, to turn away from homosexuality, to turn away from homoeroticism, there is this very real question in my mind, whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual, why is it such a big deal? And I get it in terms of not wanting people to lie on your history and not wanting to discredit it and not wanting to fabricate or sensationalize things, because I do think this is a very kind of sensational thing, especially the fact that so many people think that Malcolm X was fucking hot and they'd want him to take them home. But the other part of it is that I do see this conflict between sensationalizing a figure because it's exciting or cool or interesting, and also wanting there to be an openness to how we approach history and understanding that, to me, to some degree, homophobia and not wanting someone's history to be diluted by being queer or being seen as feminine is a very real part of why some people react to this question of whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual. He was a strong man. He took care of his family. He wouldn't have. Malcolm X was smart. He was cool. He was interesting. He probably did some interesting shit in his teens or
or 20s that maybe he readily wouldn't have talked to every single person about, especially his family or his children once he became a family man. But this is also me assuming the dynamics that he probably had with his wife and children, which is a whole nother topic. When I posted about this online before, there's a lot of people that are just like, you can't say that about him. And I'm like, why not? Like, if he was queer, it would make Malcolm X even cooler. Other serious question I have, why does it matter if he was really gay versus the spectacle of it? And I think this is what Mrs. Shabazz, Malcolm X's daughter, is really speaking to. It's kind of saying like Malcolm X represented all these serious things. He was contentious to the state. He called out state powers. He faced white supremacy. He was surveyed and followed by the government. He was assassinated. And we want to talk about whether or not he was gay is kind of how I read how her interview comes across. Interesting to think about, because if I'm holding myself to task, I think for me, in a sense, it's kind of a comfort to kind of think of whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual. It's a comfort to think about the fact that he engaged in these more subversive parts of sexual and social culture, because when I was really doing my video on James Baldwin and Malcolm X and how they kind of felt an affinity towards each other, I just had this vision in my mind of them being like queer besties who could like hang out and talk to each other and confide in each other. And I mean, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. The deeper answer is that it's hard to look back at history and to really confront the wrongs, the flaws, the things that we often overstep in order to not confront the realities of what we experience today. And so sometimes when we dip into history, it is kind of fun to like dig into a question or a topic or something that is kind of regularly ignored and isn't really accounted for, especially in the mainstream space. A lot of Black communities' avoidance of this topic is the fact that they don't want to think about Malcolm X like being a top or a bottom, or wanting to go down on somebody, or being at the gay clubs, or rubbing talcum powder on this old white man. There is this aversion to any speculation or rumors that can emasculate Malcolm X. And I think that is the part of this where I kind of feel some resistance, even though I do want to respect the complexity and the reality of history. It's the weird part for me, because I'm like, why does it matter? Does it matter because it makes him less of a strong, tough, burly man with a gun looking out the window for you? Or does it matter because you just want people to understand the truth about him? How we find out the truth about historical figures, I think, is both an individual process for the people that are directly born of his legacy, people in his family, people that knew him, his peers. And I think also how we navigate history is a collective process. What kind of questions are we asking? What kind of assumptions are we bringing to certain histories? And how do those factor into what we know or what we could know? Was Malcolm X bisexual? Was he not? I don't know if we really reached a clear conclusion in this video, but I do think looking back at these different texts, looking at the criticisms of them, of the things that people are engaging with about them, there is a lot of gray area out there. Do you think that Malcolm X was bisexual or LGBTQIA, and the more likely outcome is the fact that he did some stuff in his late teens and 20s that he probably wouldn't talk about because he became a family man later on? Or do you think that this stuff is sensational? These authors are trying to profit or benefit off of this famed revolutionary's legacy by bringing in allegations or facts that might not be fully substantiated by the level of research or lack thereof that people like Mrs. Shabazz speak to? Or is it something in between? Is our nostalgia and attachment to history compelling us to see things as they were not? Or is our curiosity guiding us in a place where maybe we're getting a little bit closer to the truth?
The dark people are waking up. They're losing their fear of the white man. No place right now where he's fighting is he winning. Everywhere he's fighting someone your and my complexion. And they're beating him. He can't win anymore. Nowhere on this earth does a white man win in a guerrilla warfare. It's not his speed. It takes heart to be a guerrilla warrior. A gorilla is on his own. All you have is a rifle, some sneakers, and a bowl of rice. And that's all you need. And a lot of heart. I just want to give you a little briefing on guerrilla warfare, because before you know it,
I find more interesting than the actual question of whether or not Malcolm X is bisexual is our social, emotional, and political reactions to this. And in all of these reactions, I read a lot of different things. I read, don't talk about him like that. He was a Muslim man. He was a family man. Or don't talk about him like that. You don't know. Like, you can't be spread. You can't trust the research. Why does it matter? It matters because queer erasure is literally a fucking part of history. It's a part of Black history, it's a part of Muslim history, and it's a part of our entire collective history. So when we're engaging with questions about whether or not Malcolm X was bisexual, yes, the first paramount thing is that we take into account whether or not we trust the research that is written about these allegations of him being bisexual, and also heeding Malcolm X's daughter's criticisms of these forms of research and these biographies. But beyond that, it's important to understand and articulate why we may be also reluctant to talk about queer representation in history because of homophobia, because of misogynoir, because of a collective hatred of femininity. And this can come across in many ways. And so when we're thinking about Blackness and its relation to masculinity and the patriarchy, homophobia is present in the Black community. When we think of Islam and the different expressions of it all around the world, because there are so many different expressions of it, we have to think about how there's the Western assumption that Islam equals homophobia, although there is evidence of that throughout the Islamic religion. And then we also have to consider the fact that we have clear evidence throughout various parts of history about how queer and LGBTQIA people have been targeted, and how people like Bayard Rustin or James Baldwin were ousted out of Black movements in a variety of ways because of their sexuality and because of their openness about their queerness, bisexuality, homosexuality. And so when we start from this standpoint, the question becomes less, was Malcolm X bisexual, and more, why are so many people in resistance to this possibility? And what does it say about our willingness to imagine real complex expressions of queerness throughout Black, Muslim, and radical history? So welcome to another Black radical history lesson. We're gonna dig into it. So this video is going to be for anyone that is interested in exploring why queerness or bisexuality is a discomfort point for many people when looking at Black, queer, radical, or Muslim history, and for people that just want to dig into a little bit more about, like, let's talk about the complexities of homophobia, because I think it can come up in many different ways. It can look like many different things, and I've seen a lot of it in the comments to my last video. And if you haven't seen that Malcolm X bisexual video, I highly recommend you check it out because the intro is hilarious. But for this first section, I want to have some bare bones kind of definitions around what Islam is and what are different representations of queerness in Islam and the Quran. And the first resource I've pulled up is the Human Rights Coalition has a resource that is titled Stances of Faith on LGBTQIA Issues, Islam, Sunni, and Shiite. More than 500 million Muslims inhabit this planet, and they inhabit geographic, linguistic, and cultural spaces that are enormously diverse. As a result, their beliefs on issues relating to LGBTQIA people cannot be easily summarized. With over 1 billion followers, Islam is the second largest religion in the world and noted for its diversity of culture and ethnicity. Founded by the Prophet Muhammad in 622 CE, Islam is an Abrahamic religion that shares its roots with Judaism and Christianity and recognizes Abraham, Moses, and Jesus as prophets. Its sacred texts are the Quran, and secondary sources are found in cultural practices such as Sunnah and less so in Hadith, which continue to be studied and interpreted by both scholars and the faithful. At the core of Islam is the Shahada, a declaration of faith that states there is no God but God, and later adaptations added, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The Shahada is one of the 5 pillars of Islam that includes charitable giving, fasting, praying several times each day, and going on pilgrimage to Mecca, if economically feasible, at least once in a lifetime. Because Islam has no central governing body, it is not possible to state clear policies regarding issues of interest to LGBTQIA people. Depending on nationality, generation, family upbringing, and cultural influences, Islamic individuals and institutions fall along a wide spectrum, from welcoming and inclusive to a level of rejection that could be marked by a range of actions from social sequestrianism to physical violence. And so what I read in this is that within Islam, there is a vast array of complexities around how people view homosexuality, how they view queerness, how they view LGBTQIA-ness. And I wanted to bring in another perspective here from an article from Cinemoval, New York, titled Covering Up Queer Muslims. And this opens by stating, it's assumed that being queer and Muslim or being erased within a Muslim's community is irreconcilable. As a result, to be Muslim and queer means existing between two spaces. On one side is a Western space, where certain rights are granted for queer folk, where we can elaborate on what it means to be queer, even while state legislatures pass laws condemning our existence. On the other exists a space where we must hide, where secularism itself is a charged subject and belief in Allah is seen as exclusively heteronormative. I often feel Islam's only reference point in queerness is violence and oppression. Although violence against queer people in Muslim communities is a real issue, how do we reconcile that in the area before Orientalism, there were letters, poems, songs, paintings, and photographs which attest to queer and gender nonconforming communities that lived within these same communities? For years, I had grown up thinking that queerness did not exist in Muslim, particularly Albanian history, and for years this historical absence became personal proof to me that I was an aberration, abnormal and unnatural. However, in recent years, more and more evidence has come to light providing that historically queer communities existed in Albania, Turkey, Iraq, Palestine, Egypt, Sudan, Senegal, and many more regions of the world within Muslim communities. The covering up of Islam has not only been a physical veil, as American media would promote, but throughout a colonial process of erasing these identities and perceiving them through a white European Christian gaze. And what I love about this article in particular is that it goes through all of these different examples, histories, artworks, examples of artwork that show people throughout different points of Muslim history depicting queerness, depicting homosexuality, depicting LGBTQIA life, and it being something that is contested both among Muslims who will read the Quran and reference Sodom and Gomorrah and say that the attack on these savages was mainly because they were homosexual, while other people simply read that as the people living in these particular areas, Sodom and Gomorrah, were particularly bad people because they would literally attack and assault the people passing by, no matter what their gender. It was not about their sexuality. And so in my reading and researching these things for this video, I've sort of began to understand this sort of complex relation to Muslim identity in the diaspora through the same way that I understand Christianity as a Jamaican American, as a Black person. There are Christians that are very, very tied to the Bible and they read all of the terminology and the verses literally. And then there are other interpretations that are based in dialectical materialism, that are based in historical context, and that speak to how Christianity, on some level, through certain perspectives, demand a love for all human beings and that we are all born the way we are meant to be in this world, without all of the boundaries, constraints, and stigmas that more conservative forms of religion heap onto us. And so when we're thinking about this question of whether or not Malcolm X was queer, whether or not he was bisexual, would his participation in the Nation of Islam have turned him away from this? There are many, many different considerations. There is the fact that the Nation of Islam is known to be a very homophobic branch of Islam. I mean, even in the last few years, the Nation of Islam has slammed BET and Lil Nas X, particularly Lil Nas X, because he is this deviant expression of Black masculinity that is trying to push the gay agenda. And if we look at even my last video where I reference one of Malcolm X's daughter's criticisms of, I think, Manning Marable's book, which alleges that Malcolm X might have been bisexual or might have been done bisexual sex work, his daughter says, my father loved all human beings. He wouldn't have had a problem with gay people. He was not particularly gay. And so even in this reading of Malcolm X that we could have, we can't flatten him into a Nation of Islam Muslim, because there was a point in time where he saw the contradictions within various aspects of the Nation of Islam and decided to leave and turned more towards an internationalism and a deeper communalism. So would this communalism not have included some sort of serious consideration or perspective on LGBTQIA people if Malcolm X had been given the time and life to live through the 70s and the 80s, the movements towards sexual liberation. All of these things could have maybe opened up Malcolm X to new worlds that the Malcolm X that died in 1965 would have had no chance to ever been exposed to. And in the ways that we can understand the complexities of queer Muslim identity, we can see various pieces of evidence to this today. I can think of the page Queer Habibi, which is an artist who does beautiful LGBTQIA depictions of Muslim people in various settings, whether it be sultry or in public. I think of also the social media page, which shares anarchist news and anti-capitalist news and perspectives and media from a queer Muslim perspective. There's also the forthcoming book, Queer Hijab Blues, by the author Lamia H. And this book is a memoir depicting this author's life as a queer Muslim person that eventually moves to the US and has to contend with their gender, sexuality, and their non-normative perspectives on Western processes related to queer identity, like coming out. And so even in this description of this book, we can see an engagement with contemporary life through a queer Muslim non-binary person's lens. And in terms of the readings or perspectives on history in relation to queer Muslim history, how many times are we having conversations where we're actually listening to queer Muslim people speak to their own experiences and the intersectionality of how they relate to their religion, how they relate to their spirituality, how they relate to their body and their autonomy? So if you haven't checked out this book, I highly recommend you check it out. I also found a podcast that was a really good listen. It's the Queer Collective podcast, and it is titled Can You Be Muslim and Queer, featuring Bilal Ahmed. And I'll play a few clips of this podcast so you can hear for yourself.
Every single thing that you said or did was policed by everyone around you, right? If you're wearing something pink, it's like, dude, like, are you gay or something? You know, like that, and that would be my every single day, right? Where it was like majority of my closet is just like not colorful clothes. Forget jewelry. I wouldn't even like do skincare because I was so scared that it was considered something feminine and that it would like out me to people, right?
But what I really love about this podcast is that it does talk about a lot of the complexities of how areas that have a more conservative Islam kind of have this policy around queerness or LGBTQIA-ness that is, it can be tolerated as long as it isn't flashed in front of our faces, or this kind of don't ask, don't tell kind of mentality. And when I was listening to this podcast, it really made me realize that I want to read and engage with more queer Muslim perspectives on life and politics, because it really reminded me of like growing up and visiting Jamaica, of growing up in a Black family, being in a Black community where you being queer is a problem if it's visible enough for it to be speculated about. And it can be a thing where it's very much tolerated, but not accepted. And I think these sort of commonalities in terms of these more conservative strains of religion, whether it be Christianity or whether it be Islam, we can see this sort of thread of there being this sort of social space where it has existed in the past, where it maybe hasn't been given a complex name or a complex series of names, but there is this sort of notion that within Muslim spaces, within Christian spaces, that queerness can exist, but it might just not be legible in those spaces as queerness, as LGBTQIA-ness. It might be seen as like, oh, they're a little bit weird, or they're funny, or they just don't date people, or oh, I mean, they just like, they live over there, like they're kind of Americanized now, they're Western, or yeah, like maybe America did that to you. Like there are all these processes that this area of understanding queerness and Islam, I think, should be understood with the same complexity that some people may offer Christianity or Judaism or other religions, in terms of how there are some areas where it's celebrated, there are some areas where it's simply accepted, but people don't push to make it a visible thing in public life. And there are also other spaces where people are fighting to define their narratives for themselves, just like this author Lamia, and just like how I attempted to do in my own ways in my debut book, When They Tell You to Be Good. I think as a writer, it's very important that we have these sort of historical records that are first person perspectives about what it means to live at the margins of a certain kind of society. I think about the utility of slave narratives of the past, whether it be Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman or other former slaves. I think about how many immigration narratives have been coming out of the US and Central and South America over the last decade in reaction to all of the various immigration policies, the peeling back of DACA, and the migrant caravan crisis at the US-Mexican border. All of these are symbologies of the fact that the further and further that we progress as a human species, ideally, the more complex and diverse narratives we have in our landscape to show that erasure and stigma should not only be the controlling force in how we look at our histories, it should also be a willingness to engage with what actually existed and what foundational texts, religions, ideas, paradigms do we have that cause us to turn away from the literal reality of the fact that queer people have existed throughout every part of human life. And this includes Islam, this includes Christianity, this includes literally every part of the world. And this also begs the question of, for some Muslim people, why is queerness so in opposition to their religiosity, their spirituality? And can this be changed or overcome? And I think this is extremely a general question. I think there are so many people that could speak to this better than I, and there are so many specific contexts that I think need to be deconstructed in this kind of conversation or thinking about this. But it is an important question, and I when I really think about homophobia in any kind of setting or arena, there should be the question of, why is queerness in opposition to the status quo, and who's established that, and who is it actually hurting if it did or does exist? And then in the second part of this video, I really want to dig into what I feel like is a bit more of the Black perspective on why I think so many people are in resistance to the potential idea that Malcolm X could have been bisexual. And in so many of these comments, I feel like I read people kind of essentially saying a number of things. One, we shouldn't spread lies about this man, and we don't know if it was actually true, and you can't trust the research. And then the other side, which is to say, like, speculating about Malcolm X in this way is disrespectful, or it devalues his legacy. And when we really look at how the patriarchy and homophobia operates within young Black people's lives, especially young Black male lives, we can see how homophobia operates as a means to police the Black body. I've talked about this in other videos, but it also fits in line with Bell Hook's notion of soul murder, which is at a young age, young boys learn again and again that there are rules that they need to follow or else they won't be socially accepted. And so they learn to hide parts of themselves, to kill off parts of themselves piece by piece. And so with this in mind, I asked the question, what in Malcolm X's life would have pushed or compelled him to be a certain kind of masculinity? Would it have been the dysfunction in his home life? Would it have been the fact that him and his siblings were separated by the child welfare system? Would it have been the fact that he struggled to get through high school and was pushed into spaces with white people and eventually ended up in the streets and sold drugs and would pimp people out and had to find subversive ways to make money? Embedded in all of these different criticisms of the idea or mere concept of Malcolm X being bisexual is this idea that femininity is somehow a denigration of a Black person's identity, a Black person's place. And this kind of argument around like being gay or bisexual might have made him less tough or revolutionary. It really is just based in like classic misogynoir, because how many dope, radical, revolutionary queer people existed? How many dope revolutionary queer women existed? How many radical revolutionary women were part of all these movements? And somehow, because of the patriarchy, their value and the work that they've put in is valued far, far less. And when we also think about the implications of homophobia, queer erasure, this denial of the possibility altogether that Malcolm X would have been bisexual, it also very much fits into this patriarchal logic that is also based in homophobia, which always demands a straight telling of history. And if we think about all of the various radical movements that we can see throughout different points, especially in the Black experience, whether it be the civil rights movement or whether it be the Black Power movement, whether it be Black Lives Matter, throughout all of these various eras of Black radical moment in space, we can see threads of Black conservatism or threads of queer erasure. In the civil rights movement, there was hella religious conservatism that leaned into this nonviolent strategy, which was based on a certain kind of respectability that said, if Black people are nonviolent, maybe we can be seen as human. Where does queerness fit into that? If you are so subversive that you can't even be accepted in the civil rights movement, what does that say? In the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panther Party, there was so much misogyny and misogynoir, it is only safe to assume that queerness was not welcomed, or at least celebrated within the party. We can say that Huey P. Newton said that he didn't care about homosexuality. It wasn't really a problem to him. He saw LGBTQIA people as human beings. But what does it also say that Huey P. Newton was accused of and potentially killing a sex worker? What does it say that he has been accused of so many other wrongs and isms within the party, particularly domestic violence? If we look at the Black Lives Matter movement, we can look at all of the criticisms of the elitism of the founders of it, hoarding money. We can look at how there are many critiques of how the mainstream Black public tends to prop up the slain men and boys of the Black community as opposed to the slain women, girls, and LGBTQIA people who have been harmed by police or horizontal gun violence. What matters less is whether or not he was bisexual, and more that there is still so much resistance to the possibility that it could have been the truth. And if it was the truth, it probably would have made him cooler.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us.
Political research and understanding and intaking political knowledge for yourself is important. I remember after college when I was working at a hotel in Big Sky, Montana, and I was cleaning rooms all the time. And you get your list, you have to spend all your time cleaning your rooms, you're alone the whole time. And because my floors were usually empty, I would try to listen to speeches throughout the day. Martin Luther King speeches, Malcolm X speeches, Fred Hampton, Huey Newton. And Malcolm X is a really great person to listen to. And James Baldwin is also a really great person to listen to. This was kind of when the civil rights movement was really popping off in 1961. Freedom rides were happening from May 1961 to December 1961, and this led to all sorts of violent attacks. But to give you a little bit of background about James Baldwin and Malcolm X, if you don't know already.
I think, that the only way to live is know you're going to die. If you're afraid to die, you'll never be able to live.
Hey, hey. Hey, hey.
And nobody knows anything about that.
Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes.
And that is also just another word.
For singing the blues.
James Baldwin, born August 2nd, 1924, died December 1st, 1978, was an influential American writer, social critic renowned for his novels, essays, and plays on themes of race, identity, sexuality. He wrote Go Tell It on the Mountain, he wrote Giovanni's Room, he wrote If Beale Street Could Talk. I've covered a lot of James Baldwin on this channel, and I think James Baldwin is a really amazing orator as well. His level of knowledge of literature and different aspects of human history, especially American history, his willingness to speak to an intrinsic humanity that we all have.
And anytime anyone teaches you to believe in a God that doesn't look like you, you give them that God back. We don't want to be around that old pale thing. We don't want to integrate with that old pale thing. We don't want to sleep next to that old pale thing. No, we can do without it. You find that old pale thing laying out in the sun, trying to get to look like you.
Born May 19th, 1925, murdered on February 21st, 1965, prominent African-American Muslim minister and human rights activist, he became a leading figure in the Nation of Islam before founding Muslim Mosque Inc. and the Organization of Afro-American Unity. On April 25th, 1961, Baldwin and Malcolm X engaged in a debate addressing the nature of racism in America and the effectiveness of the sit-in movement. Malcolm X criticized the passive approach. He stated, if their goal is integration, it's not a worthwhile one. But if their goal is freedom, justice, and equality, then it is a worthwhile one.
Family. Now, they had a different look or a different air or a different attitude than that which is...
It's so useful to watch these debates because you do get to see and hear how much the facilitator matters. Like, a lot of these debates are stages where like Malcolm X or James Baldwin are either with an ally or various adversaries. And in this conversation, there's the host, who's obviously a knucklehead. And then there's this other guy who I think has researched the Nation of Islam and Black Islam and is kind of there as an expert opinion, but is obviously sort of denigrating the movement for certain aspects of the self-defense that Nation of Islam kind of purports. And it is very interesting because this debate starts off with the interviewer basically asking Malcolm X, like, is the Nation of Islam, like, against passive resistance? Are they against nonviolence?
Our panel here to my right, Mr. Malcolm X, minister of the Temple of Islam, number 7 in New York City.
About any warfare, if the ex-slave in America has to go to war with his former slave master to get what is his by right, then that in itself is a condemnation of the former slave master. If Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years ago, which means we're supposed to be free, we're supposed to be citizens, we're supposed to be protected by the Constitution that we fight and die for, and yet at the same time today, the so-called Negro is knocking at the White House door, still begging his master to pass legislation that will give him recognition or protection by the Constitution that he is supposed to represent him. I think, sir, that the man who is depriving him of these rights cannot open up his mouth and say that it would be war. It would be wrong to go to war against him to get these things.
Because when I was younger, I did mock trial, and it made me fascinated with debate and philosophy and language. And I think it's one of the reasons that I enjoy like public speaking and videos and essays, because I do think the ways that people form arguments and also the ways that they push back against disagreements is so fascinating. This is a logical technique where you take the premise of a question or argument and extend it to its logical conclusion, exposing contradictions or absurdities. Another rhetorical move is turning the question back on itself, or counter-questioning, where you reveal the flawed assumption behind the question. This is commonly seen in Socratic dialogue, where a question is deconstructed to expose faulty logic. Who has committed most of the violence here? Like the Nation of Islam, we check people for guns and weapons. We are a big proponent of self-defense, but to whiteness, self-defense looks like terrorism. This counter-questioning, I think, is so vital in today's day and age. And the thing I really want to dig into, and I've talked about it on my podcast a lot, and I think a lot of the reasons that people respect how Malcolm X talks about self-defense is that I view it as anti-fascism. Like, if whiteness is a fascist force that controls the economy, that controls our educational system, that controls the police and prison systems, that still uses laws from Britain and maritime laws to influence the rules and laws that dictate the world that we live in now, what should our logical kind of conclusion be? Instead of asking Black people if we have the right to defend ourselves, to violently defend ourselves, instead we should be looking at what has created the conditions for us to even have to need to defend ourselves in the first place. And what is wild is that there's a part of this debate where I think it's the interviewee basically says, well, like Nation of Islam claims that they want to do all this stuff, but who's helped Black people as much as white people?
Well, I marvel sometime that if, as is said by the Muslim speakers, that the white man has hated the Negro since he has been on earth, why has the white man done so much to help the Negro? For example, I noticed they abolished the slave trade in Africa and from here to Africa, and I don't know when any of the Muslim states have done that. They've set up schools and clinics and hospitals and asylums and colleges throughout all Black Africa. I don't know that anybody can point out one Muslim college or university south of Egypt and Morocco in Africa for the education of Black people. Now, these things have been done, and it doesn't seem to me that this is the action of people that hate a whole people. Of course, there are white people who hate Negroes, but I don't see any reason or justification for exaggerating the situation.
And when Malcolm X comes back, he spits. He spits.
And your leader is quoted in Mr. Lincoln's book as saying that he wants to use an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and he wants to end white rule in the U.S. He wants to overthrow it, to use the quotation.
If Mr. Lincoln said that, Mr. Lincoln is 1,000% wrong.
What does he mean by the quotation, then? We must take things into our own hands. What does it matter if 10 million of us die? There will be 7 million of us left.
If you have crimes, such as those that were committed against Emmett Till, and the government itself could go into Mississippi and find the exact culprits who committed the crime, or the type of crime that was committed against Mac Parker, and again the government agents go in there and find the culprits who were guilty of murdering Mac Parker, and then turn around and the government admit that it is not able to bring those murderers to justice, I think that it would be insane on the part of any man to deny the family of Mac Parker or the family of Emmett Till the right to come together and defend themselves, since the government admits that it can't. It is helpless to defend them.
I take that to be your justification of the use of violence by Negroes.
If America is justified in retaliating against Japan when Japan strikes her, or retaliating against Germany when Germany strikes her, or retaliating against any other country to defend herself from attack, I think that America has reached the point of insanity to think that the world would look upon the black people here in America as being wrong if they took a stand to defend themselves against the crime that the white man is committing against us here day and night.
I don't see why you don't answer the man's question. Are you for force or are you against force? If you're for force and the use of force, then that's sedition. Why don't you level on the thing instead of curving all
Is it? Wait a moment. No. I didn't come. You can't put words in my mouth.
Pardon me, let Mr. Stout
have time.
But I want to get that point right there straight. Since it is Islam and the Muslims who are being discussed here, and it is Islam and the Muslims who are under fire, I think that it is only right to expect me to give you my answer, not someone else's answer, because this is what primarily has been done here in America. Everyone else speaks for the Muslims, and they're not allowed to speak for themselves. Now, you don't put a yes and no answer today in the mouth of any black man, other perhaps than Mr. Schuyler.
Nobody. Absolutely a fucking masterclass. He pushed back against token integration, which he thinks that, like, the whole civil rights movement, which if you listen to my podcast, especially in our Should Black People Vote episode, and then also on this channel in my Why Voting Isn't the Answer video, I do talk a lot about the logic of integration. And I love when I can go back and find speeches and find like a phrase that I'm like, oh, that's what I've been thinking of for years and years and years. The way Malcolm X spits, I'm like, oh, bro, come back. Both Malcolm X and James Baldwin are, instead of answering about the logic of blackness, they're demanding that these interviewers acknowledge the tangible history and violence that whiteness and white supremacy has committed, and how it does not make sense for black people to be asked to consider and do things that white people and white culture and white supremacy has not done. To ask black people to passively advocate for ourselves, to ask black people to really pay for white people's sins. And if we take that further and further, and if we look at the entirety of US history, it's the constant transference of white responsibility for its own actions onto black and poor bodies. Like, literally think about what Trump and the Trump administration is fighting to do now. They are fighting to blame trans people, to blame queer people, to blame migrants, to blame immigrants, to blame criminals, when white culture and colonization has snuck into all different corners and parts of the world and committed acts of violence and terrorism. White culture has innovated slavery and psychological torture and abuse to subjugate entire generations of people. White culture and colonization has tanked entire economies, invested millions of billions of dollars into war and genocide and weaponry and militarism and borders and policing. Yet, it's everyone else that has to survive that suffering. And it's also white people that have to survive it too. And so it's just really, this video is just so, I would say if you need something to center you and to remind you of some core logics that can help you navigate right now, because I'm listening to this and I'm looking at the fact that the Trump administration claimed that so much of our government is useless, fired all these people haphazardly, without just cause, without just reasoning, and put in an administrative cabinet that is worth over $300 billion, people that work in tech, work in STEM, and hired those people who have no political experience, including people that made a Signal chat to talk about war plans? In this battle against disinformation and fascism, we have to be practiced in counter-questioning, in disrupting the logics of whiteness and white supremacy and fascism. We have to be good at researching for ourselves, understanding what's happening on a local and national and global level for ourselves. We have to find means of archiving our histories and information. We have to find modes of communication that allow us to speak freely and strategically about the news, politics, social movements, repression. All of these are the ongoing battle of asserting our reality and truth under a political system that is actively trying to erase our reality, is actively using militarism and other forces to assert its social hierarchy, its economic hierarchy. And it really is just wild that I could listen to something from over 60 years ago and feel all of this in my body. So it's just wild. It's wild. It's wild. Go listen to this debate. Please go listen to this debate. It's so good. It's so good. It's so good. I'm just blown away.
The American system killed my brother. The hatred, the cultivated hatred, the desire to lust for power, the desire to control, the desire to hinder progress, to profess freedom and then block it.
What do you think of Malcolm X's death?
I know it was no accident.
Who do you believe is responsible for Malcolm X's death?
The white power structure in America is behind it. They're quick to capitalize on by saying that one of his own kind did it, but they put it up to be done.
What do you mean, the white power structure?
The white power structure of America. They know they had more to gain by getting Malcolm X out the way than they had to buy and let him live. That's why I say.
But what is the white power structure?
Never mind. I just said the white power structure. You know the white race, don't you?
In the last year, like Roy Wilkins said, he changed. He wanted to get along with the white people. But you people didn't want to get along with us.
What does Malcolm X's death mean to you? What do you feel about it?
What do you feel about me?
What do you feel about
It's a blow to every black people in the United States of America. Black!
It's what?
It's a blow, he said.
It's a blow?
Blow, he said.
Yes.
He says a blow to every black American, black people in the United States. That's what he was saying.
Why is it a blow to you?